Good day. This is ENG 328, Study Session 3. Christopher Okigbo, Idealism and Commitment. Introduction. Christopher Ifeanyi Chukwu Okigbo was born 16 August 1932 in Ojoto, a small village some 10 miles from Onitsha, Anambra State, Nigeria. The fourth of 5 children, Okigbo received his primary education at Umolobia Catholic School. He developed an interest in music, mathematics, literature, and Latin, and also became an outstanding athlete, excelling in soccer and cricket. He passed the Cambridge exams with distinctions, which guaranteed his admission into the University College, Ibadan, in 1950. Then the only university in Nigeria. It is now the University of Ibadan. To study classic, which had a great influence on his poetic works. In this study session, you will learn about Christopher Okigbo, his life, the style of his poems, and social realities informing them. Learning outcomes. After the study session, you should be able to point out realities in Okigbo's life which influence his poetic sensibility as encoded in his early poems. 2. Analyze Okigbo's poetry. Background and early poems. The poetry of Christopher Okigbo is autobiographical, religious, political, imagistic, and he began his poetic career by dissociating himself from idea of categorizing writers by race or region. He was determined to be a poet, not an African poet. Okigbo envisioned poetry as a means of self-expression for projecting the many moods of the inner self, as a record of the inner conflict within the context of the dynamics of rituals and mites. He embraced the old classic as well as the new greats. He was influenced by Horace, Catullus, Ovid, Virgil, Tacitus, Aristophanes, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Aristotle, John Keats, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Browning, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and Helen Ginsberry of the Beat generation in the United States. This made him an eclectic poet, borrowed from different traditions. Okigbo's earliest poems, all included in collected poems, are On the New Year, 1958 to 1959, Moon Glow, 1960, Love Apart, 1962, and Four Canzons, 1962. The Four Canzons lyric poems, often set to music, are Song of the Forest, Debtor's Lane, Lament of the Flutes, and Lament of the Lavender Mist. The motive of these apprentice poems is the poet's lament of his exile from his idyllic rural origins and in on his out the endless succession or of tempers and moods of high society in urban centers like Lagos. Debtor's Lane, 1958-9. Okigbo's celebration of the fruitful fields in Songs of the Forest, in addition to the theme of return to origin and tradition in his early poems, they also signify the nature of Okigbo's poetics as an eclectic stylist. Okigbo's choice of the instrument to which the kanzis should be performed, drums ogene, a hollow metal conch, and flute, is evidence of his commitment to the African heritage, even while he borrowed freely from other cultures. He sees himself as a music maker or sound composer. Hence, in the Orpheus, the persona is regarded as a bird singing, and the image is maintained with different types of birds. Analysis of Okigbo's poetry. Heaven's Gate, the poet at childhood. Heaven's Gate is explicitly autobiographical. In this collection, Okigbo reveals the nature of his formal and informal education, recalls people from his childhood who had influenced his consciousness, and commits himself as poet priest to the services of Mother Idoto, the river goddess, as well as the village stream from which he drank and in which he washed himself. In the labyrinth, the persona in the poem, like Orpheus, is about embarking on a journey of self-discovery and self-realization, and must submit himself to the cleansing powers of the water spirit. Heaven's Gate begins as a personal return to source for purification. He is to contrite and repentant as he pleads to return. Before you, Mother Idoto, naked I stand, before your watery presence, a prodigal. Under your power wait I, on barefoot, watchman for the watchword at Heaven's Gate. 1958 Ditto 19. According to Okigbo, I do not feel that, in fact, as a Christian, I have ever been uprooted from my own village gods. I believe, in fact, all these gods are the same as a Christian God, that they are different aspects of the same power, the same force. 1965 Ditto 30. The rest of Heaven's Gate reveals the process by which Okigbo's cosmopolitan and holistic intelligence was created. In the passage, the same light is also presented as a hint of the future destruction of the world by fire. Rays, violent and short, piercing the gloom, foreshadow the fire that is cleaned off. 1958 Ditto 20. The above lines clearly intimate the biblical story of the creation, the flood, and the promise of Armageddon. They also recall African myths, especially those linking the rainbow and the boa. The rainbow is linked to the boa in Igbo mythology as a premonition of some mysterious event, especially death. Among the Yoruba, the rainbow is the sign that the boa has excreted. Whoever gets a piece of the excrement automatically becomes wealthy. In initiations, the second fragment of Heaven's Gate, Okigbo focuses attention on education, both formal and informal. The former represented by Christianity, captured in violent images, scar of the inflicted, 1958 Ditto 27, crucifix by blade, and concretized in the person of Cap Canley, the methodologized version of the drill master from Okigbo's school days. Essentially, Heaven's Gate portrays poetry as a record of an intelligence engaged in a multi-layered and cross-cultural spiritual quest. It is Okigbo's offering to the divine essence of Idoto, his chosen muse. The imagery here strikes a note different from that of the imagery of Christian forces. There is here genuine humility, a sense of security and hope. For Okigbo and other Anglophone West African poets, that which is African is rich and meaningful, and that which is not African, white, European, is disruptive and destructive. Limits, a prod into the public. With limits, we come to a new phase in the development of the quest. In his introduction to Labyrinth, Okigbo declares that Siren Limits presents a protagonist in pursuit of the white elephant, 1968 Ditto 6. The protagonist's search for salvation that started in Heaven's Gate continue in Siren Limits. But in the second part, Fragment Out of the Deluge, the focus had broadened to encapsulate a communal search for fulfillment. Siren Limits open with the image of a vociferous and confident protagonist, Weaverbird, he-goat on heat, who waits, anticipating his acceptance by Doto, the queen of the damp half-light, 1986 Ditto 39. Following his dialogue with the self, the poet's protagonist becomes invigorated to address his society. He can now advance with heave mist on shoulders, with brand burning out at hand end, and sing. Tongue-tied, without name or audience, making harmony among the branches, 1986 Ditto 41. Fragment Out of the Deluge brings to the fore the conflict between Christianity and traditional Africa. According to Funsho Ayejina, this fragment signals the sociological dimension of Okigbo's poetic consciousness, 2002 Ditto 589. Before now, his poetry had tended to focus on the individual and the search for self-realization. In Fragment Out of the Deluge, Okigbo presents, in retrospect, some details about his protagonist and his milieu. He examines the collective rape of Africa and its mysteries by colonialism as a major thematic preoccupation of modern Anglophone West African poetry. According to R. Egudu, the African poets who have handled colonialism as their subject are, to that extent, concerned with what had been, with a past that was overwhelming in itself and still remains overwhelming, 1978 Ditto 8. This chronology also relays the destruction of traditional African culture, opens with the faces of Egyptian pharaoh into a fennel branch, a metaphor of resurrection, of reincarnation. From Egyptian civilization, Okigbo moves to the figure of Christ as Messiah, who, in spite of his miracles, was rejected and crucified. Hence, the spread of Christianity as represented in Irish missionaries who sow the fair seed among grasses, 1986 Ditto 46. The protagonist, portrayed as a songbird, sees this as the beginning of larger tragedy, the tragedy of the destruction of African culture, predicated its limits. 7. A fleet of eagles over the oil-beam shadows holds the square under course of their breath, 1986 Ditto 47. Silences in the eye of turbulence. In Silences, Okigbo advances his preoccupation from the colonial area to the contemporary. In the introduction of Labyrinth, Okigbo reveals that Silences was informed by the event of the day. The first part, Lament of the Silent Sisters, 1963, by the political turmoil of Western Nigeria in 1962 and the assassination of the anti-imperialist Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister in the Congo, now Zaire, by reactionary forces. The second part, Lament of the Drums, 1965, by the imprisonment of Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the leader of the opposition in Nigeria, and the tragic death of his eldest son in an automobile accident. Silence is, as a matter of fact, a dirge, song of lament, inspired by the tragedy of independent Africa. Okigbo presents his lament within the dirge tradition of Africa with its call and response, audience, performance structure. Although Okigbo's focus is Awolowo, he sees him as an embodiment of the larger tragedy of Africa and the victims of that tragedy. For the far removed there is wailing, for the far removed, far the distance, the waiting is for the fields of crop. Distances. Apocalyptic vision of utopia. This fragment is considered by Okigbo as a poem of homecoming. In both the spiritual and the psychic sense, the protagonist finds fulfillment in a form of psychic union with a supreme spirit who is imbued with dual potency. Ayejina. In this poem, all of Okigbo's conflicting emotions in a phantasmagoria during which the protagonist is accepted into the cavernous bridal chamber of Mother Idoto, thus fulfilling his desire for a spiritual fusion with his goddess. 2002, Ditto 591. Distances, Okigbo's most beautiful poem sequence, operates at the level of transcendental and the surreal, inspired by parts of the poet's actual experience of surgery under general anesthesia. Distances presents a foregoing protagonist in a state of possession, having been transmitted from flesh to phantom on a horizontal plane, operating table or altar. According to Emmanuel Ingara, distances represent a major turning point. It comes at the end of a long quest for a poetic vision. The quest results in a positive development both in social consciousness and in artistic excellence. It is more graceful and enchanting rhythmic beat. It deals with issues that are of public concern, and it communicates better with the reader. 1990, Ditto 41. Path of Thunder, a Final Testament. In Path of Thunder, Okigbo has accepted the social function of poetry. He has adopted critical realism as an aesthetic ideology and eschewed the philosophy of art for art's sake. He has indeed come home. 1990, Ditto 47. This collection was published posthumously in 1968. Path of Thunder continues in its examination of Nigeria's political conflict, the theme of Lament of Drum, It can be divided into poems dealing with the situation in Nigeria immediately before the January 1968 coup d'etat and poems relating with the coup and its aftermath. The pre-coup poems Elegy of the Wind and Come Thunder encapsulate the general anarchy, tension-laden situation in Nigeria at the period as a result of the constitutional fracas caused by the rigged federal election in 1964 and the rigged regional election in the West in 1965. The poet laments the arson, the deaths, and the arrogance displayed by those who have aborted the happiness of the electorate and warns, prophetically, of an impending revolution. The Thunder Among the Clouds, 1968-92. Many had believed that the January 1966 coup would be the medical leaf that will heal the nation's bleeding phallus. In the other segment, which deals with the post-coup poems, Okigbo brings to bear the techniques of a fabulist, celebrates the hunter, soldiers who have deployed thunder, guns and tanks against the elephants, politicians who had been feeling fat on the forest nation. Although he is enchanted at the extinction of the elephant clique, the poet is quick to warn of the probable consequences of an impending betrayal of the people by the emerging hunter class. But already the hunters are talking about pumpkins. If they share the meat, let them remember thunder. Hurrah for thunder. 1968-94. In the words of Ayejina, by May 1966, it had become obvious that the generals who had sidelined the architects of the January coup and appropriated the reins of power were bent on creating an Iron Dawn, a military dictatorship. 2002-594. The eagles, which had held sway over the ritual oil began, and now metamorphosed into robbers, that is, soldiers and their political allies, descending to strip us of our laughter, of our thunder. 1968-98. Against this background of continuing carnage, Okigbo affirms in Elegy for Alto, humanity's unending circle of hope and delusionment. The glimpse of a dream lies smothering in a cave, together with the mortality wounded birds. 1968-99. On Path of Thunder, Ayejina opines, it represents a successful blend of theme and style, and of the personal and the public. It is artistic triumph and an affirmation that Okigbo, the poet, has become the people's poet. Its lyrical intensity, its incantatory nature, and its fabular construction are descended from traditional African folk poetry, especially the dirge form, which Okigbo gradually grew to favor, even while writing about a subject as Western as Yeats. 2002-594. Study session summary. Okigbo has remained a source of inspiration and a challenge to other poets, especially African poets, and those who value technical excellence and the possibility of articulating complex ideas and emotions. He is more than a poet of Nigeria as he is with Africa and humanity. Theo Vincent described him as the best and most remarkable poet in African literature. 2002-595. This is the end of study session 3. Thanks for listening.